I'm going to be your initial host, and then I will pass it on to Hillary, but just a little bit of information about today's event. This B2B internal comms, do they look the same in every sector? So thank you so much for being here, and thanks for our amazing panelists to being here. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview about Nucco Brain and what we do, and why do we like to do this type of virtual and in-person events when possible. So just a little bit of a quick background. At Nucco Brain, we call ourselves a visual storytelling studio. Our job is to tell the story of our clients in a way that is engaging and most of the times it goes through visual medium. We make a proud badge of dealing with the complex or the seemingly complex, and to make it as engaging as possible. Our verticals are mainly internal comms, learning and development, and branded content. And then across these verticals, we produce quite a lot of interactive content, what we call XR. So it can be VR, AR, but also interactive in the more broad sense. And of course, there is the good old development of content like infographics, video content, and campaigns of all sorts. So today we're going to focus particularly on the internal comms part in the B2B sector, and then just going to showcase very briefly some of the work that we've done in that space. We have a very diverse group of clients, and I have to say that having done internal comms for a variety of them, it's quite interesting to see the type of differences. Today, if you want to drop us or engage with us on Twitter, is @NuccoBrain, and if you have any specific questions, please use the hashtag B2B internal comms and Nucco Brain events. We will ask the questions at the end of the panelist discussion. So please do drop us any question that you have. We also have some people in the audience, so you can type it in the chat. It's kind of up to you what your favorite way of interacting would be today. And before we start with our panel, I'm just going to cover some of the case studies and work that we've done, so that we, why at Nucco Brain are we qualified to set up an event in this space. So one of the interesting bits of campaigns that we worked on in terms of internal communication is with the John Lewis partnership, where a couple of years ago we had to communicate people about their new pension scheme campaign. It was a highly successful internal campaign with more than 60% of the audience. There was an internal audience of around 100,000 people taking direct action in the first 3 months during the campaign release, which is what the John Lewis partnership wanted. And it was not always easy to share the news about a pension scheme that was changed. Very different type of industry. We work a lot with Deloitte Digital to implement digital transformation inside of the old Deloitte group. So our internal campaign was called "We Need to Talk About Digital," and was to foster conversation rather than having a top-down approach to digital implementation inside the business as big and faceted as Deloitte. Recently, we worked a lot with Jim Beam to implement their new partnership manuals. So this is a completely different type of company, fast consumer goods, and the idea was really to help the people inside of Jim Beam make the best use of all the different partnerships that they have with many other brands out there. So we created a partnership playbook that was then shared with video campaign material internally. For Rolls-Royce Engineering, we did quite a lot of work in terms of helping them with social media etiquette when it came to sharing or not sharing very sensitive information about the amazing things that they work on, and for which we created a specific character that has been basically the protagonist of their internal comms for this campaign and others. And then last one, completely different sector again, banking for HSBC. There was a new approach to client engagement for the people of HSBC that dealt with any type of customers, called Serve, Empower, Grow. And our job was to create a series of content, both visual, video, and written, that would help the different HSBC employees embrace and know what they were getting into with this new system. So this is just a little bit of an overview to showcase the type of industries that we've been dealing with and why we think that it's quite a fascinating idea to delve in the difference when it comes to B2B and internal comms. So without further ado, let me pass the ball to Hilary, that is our host and the marketing strategist at Nucco Brain, and she's going to introduce our awesome panelists.
All right, good morning. Thank you for joining us so early. We're testing the time, so let's see how this goes. We are extremely lucky to have this panel of experts with us today. They actually cover 8 different industries, including, I'm going to list them all, professional services, gambling, pharma, oil, government, financial services, technology, and retail. I hope I didn't miss any. So I know that everyone here is going to walk away more educated about different tried and tested best practices across many industries with internal comms. So I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves and their experience, the industries they've worked in, and they're going to start by telling their favorite internal comms career story. And then we'll jump into the discussion. We will have 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, so save your questions up or share them in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that they are covered at the end. So Madeleine, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Madeleine Kavanagh. I've been working in internal communications for more decades than I care to think about. It's generally professional services, financial services. I worked for a long time in an early iteration of Willis Towers Watson, as it is now. It used to be Watson Wyatt partnership back in the day. I've worked in banking, insurance. I did an interesting segue into construction industry, working for Lang O'Rourke, which was something very different. Carlson Wagoney Travel. My favorite story does not put me in a good light. When I was working for UBS Global Asset Management, I was given the opportunity to cross over and do the advertising for a small piece of global asset management. The very first ad that I placed in somewhere like The Economist, which I'd sweated blood, sweat and tears over, it went live, and I realized that I'd spelt asset with 3 S's, which was just incredibly embarrassing. That's it. That's me.
Perfect. All right, John, do you want to go ahead?
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm John Hosken. I've worked in internal comms on and off since I think the mid-80s, and actually for a previous incarnation of Watson's. So when it was just called Watson and Partners, I believe. I've worked in pharma, oil, government, and banking. And my story is about how I'd gone away from the industry for a bit to mess about with .coms for a few years and come back rather nervously into a manufacturer, which I think is one of Nucco's clients. I was on that list there. And my first sort of party piece was putting out a newsletter, and I sent the newsletter to all and sundry, including the director. And everybody was quite kind about it until after about 2 days, I got a from the director, which was basically 3 pages of diatribe saying why the hell was I bothering him with this silly little project, and if he wanted to know anything about it, he'd just wheel in the project director. Well, of course, that was his as a director of the whole company, but I thought that was my days were seriously numbered. But my managers were made of sterner stuff. I went along to comms to basically grovel guys and get a good smacking, and as a result of that, I changed list, made sure he never got it again, and that comms received it, and everybody was happy. And 18 months later, I was still there when the project ended. So, well done me. I suppose the basic moral of that story is, don't let the buggers grind you down. Over to you.
Perfect. James, you want to go ahead?
Hi there, I'm James Griffiths, so I'm Internal Communications Business Partner at GVC. So we are a FTSE 100 company, and we're in the gambling sector. My career started out at WPP. I was a market researcher, so a lot of my early career experiences involved external comms, marketing, and helping brands improve their advertising and that kind of thing. I joined Ladbrokes about 5 years ago and have since been through a merger when we merged with Coral. to become the Ladbrokes Coral Group, and since then an acquisition where GVC acquired the Ladbrokes Coral Group, and so now we're a huge international business with 25, 26 brands. And for me, it's going through those processes of the merger and acquisition that they're my big story, my success stories, I think, because undoubtedly there is so much uncertainty for people when you go through M&A, and people are looking to comms for reassurance and guidance, and if you can get it right, it makes such a big impact on how people feel on a day-to-day basis. The Ladbrokes and Coral merger took about 18 months, so you've got 18 months of uncertainty. Inevitably there's job losses, but if you can get the comms right and people feel like they've been treated right, you come away feeling like you've done a good job as a comms professional.
Perfect. We'll dive into that a bit more as well, I think, later in the chat. And then Benjamin, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Benjamin Griffiths and I'm an internal comms manager at BT. So again, we're a FTSE 100 company, and I think everybody in the UK will know who BT are. And I guess at the moment we are going through a massive change. So we're trying to, first of all, rebrand and reshape our future to reclaim, I suppose, our title as a real necessity in people's home rather than just, I suppose, grandma's old broadband line at the moment. So my previous experience has been in retail for about 4 years. And then before that, I was working in services in Australia. So quite a vast and very different career. And I think retail has been some of the fastest paced work I've ever done in my life. It's just ridiculous how quick and how reactive and how proactive you have to be with retail. And I think one of my favorite stories is trying to get recyclable carry bags into our Co-op stores. So a couple of years ago, we decided to trial them in a certain amount of stores, but the material that we were using wasn't strong enough. So senior leaders were quite quick to give up with it and, kind of, we'll try another day. And we actually had a meeting about our transformation and change. And this issue came up when the CEO was sat in the room. And I said to him that I'd pitch 3 different suppliers that would be able to supply them, and we'd be able to get them in stores in 6 months. And then 3.5 months later, we had recyclable carry bags in 1,400 stores, so compostable ones. So I think, again, it's just one of those where sometimes you just have to push to do the thing that's right. And sometimes internal comms are the guys that will do that.
Awesome. Well, welcome. And thank you again for joining us. We're going to dive right into the discussion talking about the size of your workforce and what effect that might have on your internal comms. So the first question is, what is the size of your workforce and how do you ensure consistency and communication across it?
Shall I start?
Sure.
Okay. So we have a workforce of just over 6,500. There are 35 offices in 23 countries. The key statistic is really that we have 568 partners, and you have to know about that. We're split probably just over 50% of fee earners and just under 50% of business professionals, and that is also a key factor. For consistency across that number of countries, we have a Monday morning stand-up in London, so that's the headquarters of the company, and that's where a lot of BCM, which is part of where internal comms sits, is brand communication and marketing. They're established, so we have a Monday morning stand-up, which has now become a Monday morning conference call, where we share just the activities that we're involved in that are relevant across, that we think will be relevant across BCM. We have a monthly global call, and we have a monthly, we also, BCM contributes to the monthly client and market development. So that's the kind of business development marketing side of it. So it's all about communication and making sure that people know what we're doing and have the ability to kind of ask questions and pick stuff up.
Yes, I think the important part there is that in effect you provide the consistency. You are the kind of well, I put it in high-flying words. It's almost the soul of the company. You get them to stand to what they've said before, unless of course there's a very good reason for changing it. Keynes said a long time ago when somebody asked him why he'd changed his mind. He said, well, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And I think that's well worth bearing in mind as we move through. But nevertheless, you do need to maintain that consistency. And I think that applies in all sizes of organization, because it's an important part of credibility, and credibility is the whole point, the whole reason we're there. So maintain that, and you're doing it.
We're a business of 25,000 nearly, and I think that's quite a challenge. It's a challenge because we've got so many different functions. Retail is a completely different beast to our office corporate environment, different channels and different mixes. The key to it, in getting around that and getting around different geographies, we found is effective business partnering. We line up our internal comms team so we've got a partner in each key function of the business, and that allows them to really get to know what's going on, really get close and build the relationships with the leaders in that area of the business, because that ultimately is that if we get the leaders on board with the key corporate messages, then we can filter things down. But we've got to take into the fact that there's not a one size fits all for everyone in our business, because there's just too many different functions and too many different practices going on.
Yeah, I agree. I think so at BT we have an audience of 100,000 people, and it's really, really hard. We have operations in over 180 countries. So I think what we find difficult is my team that runs the comms for consumer is 20,000 people in the UK, and our audiences are segmented and different within that. So we've got a retail estate in there, we've got contact centers, we've got corporate function, and the message is tailored differently to each audience. So we have frontline comms teams that look after tailored comms for the retail and contact centers, yet we would do stuff for corporate. So I think over a business that size, we also have business partners as well that partner into commercial, into digital, because we need to have those really close relationships with MDs at that level, because they know what's going on in their specific business unit, but we might not. And I guess, you can tailor as much from a central point, but you sometimes, yes, you have to tailor stuff to your audience, and that's how we do it.
I don't know if you find, Benjamin, those leaders in the different areas, they all have different styles and different ways that they like to communicate.
Yeah.
And it becomes quite challenging when you try and push a certain style on them. It's better to work with them and their style to get the message out.
Yeah, and sometimes it's really hard to push back. So we'll get requests in, whether it's from an MD or whether it is from one of the business partners, say, we want to do this in our area. And we're saying, right, is that right for the business as a whole, or is that right just for you? So if you then go rogue and start creating your own comms and your own things, does it align with what our business strategy is? And sometimes it doesn't, and you have to say, no, it doesn't. And then that's when the really hard conversations happen.
Yeah.
That's a good segue actually into our next question, which is, at which point does the size of the workforce matter significantly? Are there tiers or thresholds that mean you have to kind of change your comms, or is it just large, medium, small? Kind of when does that take effect?
Again, for me, it's I think absolute numbers matter less than the audience needs and the different roles. So it's all about for messages to land, they have to be relevant to the actual audience, and for the most part, they have, the messaging has to. If it's a call to action, then they'll give it time. But if it's just kind of a woolly nice to have, then it doesn't land very well. But so I don't think it's a numbers game. I think it's about knowing what the audience wants to know.
It's also to do, I think, with the way in which they want to receive their message, or the way in which it's most effective in transmitting that message. So I've been wondering recently how delivery companies act in touch with their drivers, and I suppose the obvious answer is through the that tells them where the next box has to be delivered. And that's not something that was available when I was doing all this stuff in great detail. So I think that using those systems to provide messaging as well in between times is probably a very effective way of getting to them. If you would send them a newsletter, they'd probably chuck it in the bin. If you send them a message it's going to have a completely different impact. So I think that needs to be a crucial concern for, well, various types of businesses that have different types of workforce. So it's the type of workforce, I agree with Madeleine, that matters, and not rather than the size.
Yeah, I fully agree with that as well. I think it is far easier to communicate to one office of 1,000 people than 10 offices of 100 people, same number of people. You're absolutely right. Understand your audience, understand what channels work for them, and structure yourself around that rather than thinking in pure number terms.
Sounds like we're in agreement on that, so that's great. So we're going to jump into best practices now. And just asking each of you to share what best practices do you have to engage with your internal audiences? Have you tried new strategies and implemented new ideas, or is it kind of status quo all the time?
I think it's easier for me to say what doesn't work than what does work. Our intranet is a SharePoint, is on a SharePoint platform. It's not popular. The lawyers only use it to retrieve technical information. They don't use it to satisfy information needs. The things that work for partners are who are a very, very kind of smart bunch. So they have things that are partner briefings that are cascaded down from the top down. So if that's an important message, you really need to get into a partner briefing for the partners. Knowledge and thought leadership is a part of which is called Kettle within Clifford Chance, is a good stream, because they are very keen to know to have new knowledge, and if you want them to pay attention, then things like client endorsements. If you have client feedback and endorsements, that's a really good content for your messaging that will make them sit up. Trying new things, this is a great time to try new things. So we've overcome our issues about technology very fast because we've had to. So things like Yammer have taken off big time over the last 3 months. So that's that's been very helpful to us.
Yeah, we've just introduced a new podcast for our internal audience, and I think the key to it all is knowing what your channels are good for and what they're less good for. So you introduce a new channel and it's exciting. You think, right, let's do loads of podcasts, and very quickly it's very easy to move away and start putting content into those things that are probably best served on other channels, be it blogs or vlogs or whatever. Podcasts are very good for conversational, the here and now, hot topics, getting your leaders to speak and things that people want to hear about. But they're not so good for operational messages. So understanding what channels are good and bad for is probably the key in my mind to how you adapt and evolve your comms processes.
Yeah, I agree. I think so we launched Workplace at BT in November last year. So basically all of our content now goes out via that to all of our employees. So we have an intranet that's outdated and old, which we're trying to update. I think what we realized is that the more engaging it is because it's social, so we can put out business updates. You might want to put stuff, like you said, more of the operational stuff. If the HR system is going to be down for 2 days, you don't want to put that as a workplace post because people aren't going to engage with that. But to be able to tell your colleagues stories, to be able to share new products and new information, competitions, and it's a really great way to share on that platform as well. So I think that's what we found really, really useful. But then there is a time and a place for it, and sometimes you don't want to use those channels for certain things, especially if it's super corporate, super HR. It can be a little bit dry for people as well.
Yes, I think that's true. And it's a fact what best is what tests best. So you need to, with this moment in time when we're using completely new channels, you've got an opportunity to try new things, see if they work, ditch them if they don't, and move forward. And it might even include social media, although obviously there are lots of confidentiality issues around that, and people might inadvertently breach that confidentiality. So quite what the legal considerations there are, I don't really know, but suck it and see, essentially.
It sounds like intranets can be a bit of a challenge, but digital can be used as a tool. And so that's really interesting. I was wondering, we'll kind of move into how do you leverage digital in your comms, and what main platforms do you use to disseminate your communications? It may be your intranets, but do you use emails, and what other kind of digital tools do you use?
Shall I give Madeleine a break from going first all the time?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
We've got two main digital channels. We've got our intranet, and we've also got Microsoft Teams, which kind of feels a little bit just BAU tool, but it's a comms tool, yeah. And they're two great tools. It goes back to my point before about knowing what they're good for and what they're bad for, and actually we'll come to the realization that within the business, because the internet's social, within the business you get confusion between, well, when should I use the intranet? When should I use Teams to connect with people and interact? So we've gone through the process of saying, look, Microsoft Teams, put it in language that people understand. Microsoft Teams is kind of like your WhatsApp. If you've got a small group of people, if you want to connect with them, if you want to chat, if you want to dial them up and do a little video thing, that's your WhatsApp. But it does a different job to what Instagram or Facebook might do. That's more like what our intranet is. It's a place where we can post news and updates and keep people abreast of the key changes. And you can comment on that. You can share your news and your views. And they both work harmoniously. But actually, you kind of can't take it for granted that people automatically understand that. And once people start to make that connection between actually their complementary tools, it makes life a little bit easier.
Yeah, as I say, Yammer has really taken off, and I think that one of the great things about Yammer is the communities of interest. That's really in how people are engaging with it, and with it's growing like topsy. It's very interesting, and the kind of the push once a week in terms of this is what's happening in the ones that you've signed up to. Is really helpful. So we've got the ones that have worked, the diversity and inclusion and pride and Black Lives Matters has been a very, very useful communication tool over the past few months. And I think that's, I don't see it going back to, I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle. So I really think that it has helped internal comms, both in terms of the role that we've been playing over the last few months and also the new channels that have evolved. I think there's a little bit of rationalization that's going to have to go on in order to make it manageable going forward, but it's never going to go back to where it was, I don't think.
I think that's true. And what's interesting is that a lot of this stuff was tried out 10 or 15 years ago when the technology was early stage. There was no particular overarching need to use it, and when people really didn't get it and would rather talk face to face. Now those opportunities have been withdrawn for 2 or 3 months. People are realizing these things actually do have a value. They have a lot of limitations, but they have a value, and if you don't use them properly, then you're just going to fall out of the loop. So you need to make sure that you know how to use them. And we're using an example right now, which is Zoom, which has a lot of shortcomings, but has tremendous value for millions of people all around the world, and wasn't heard of 3 or 4 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think so. We use Workplace as our primary comms tool at the moment, and I think what's happened over the last 3 months is that we are 100% digital. We don't send out things that are print. We don't do experiential or any activations. We can't do anything where people gather. So everything we've had to do has had to be over a digital channel. So I think sometimes the pitfall is that as Workplace is a news feed, and it's kind of like Facebook, you may miss information. So if we're talking about Black Lives Matter or Pride, some of that stuff just kind of falls into the chat. And it's sometimes really hard for people to, if they're not on Workplace for a day, they might miss a ton of information that we try to communicate. So there is still a place, I think, for, again, we email a certain segment of our audience with critical business updates. We have a static intranet page that we can have our top stories on as banners. We still have other channels. But I guess what we try and do is we drive a lot of the social stuff through Workplace. And at the end of the week, we have to send out, or we've kind of created a weekly roundup so that people can kind of digest our key stories and our highlights of the week, whether it's on Workplace or the internet as well.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think one thing actually as well, a key point that to add that social digital's brought to our business, having a social intranet, is it's really helped to give a huge part of our business a voice. So particularly our people in retail who often feel a bit more disconnected from the corporate office, because the internet is social, they can post comments, ask questions. As long as they don't just fire stuff off and nobody pays any attention to it at the corporate office, as long as they're not ignored, it's a really powerful way for them to feel like they're being heard, because, well, they are being heard. So it's become a really, really valuable tool for retail.
Perfect. This is great. We're going to come back to a couple themes that we've just kind of seen. So both crisis comms and how it's been as an internal comms specialist over the past couple months, and communicating sensitive topics internally. So we'll come back to both of those topics. We did have a question from the audience that I think is really interesting. So the question is, great if you have a good intranet or other channels to communicate through, but how do you drive people to them? Is email the only way? If so, how do you stand out when people are getting hundreds of emails a day? I think that's super relevant. If anyone has any thoughts on that now.
Yeah, I'll take this one. I think there's a place definitely where you can email someone. However, that can just be something that sits in someone's inbox. So from an engagement perspective, is that engaging? I'd probably say not, it's informative. So when we launched Workplace, we held events and we made real clear post markers that this is how you join Workplace and this is why you should do it. And I think sometimes we don't give people the why they should do it, because we don't tell them what content's going to be on there. We don't tell them, the reason why we're moving in this direction and, why it's so exciting. So, you can send an email out, but it might just go ignored. What we try and do is we engage people through their leaders. So word of mouth is a great way to get people engaged. And if you engage leaders in a Cascade form, normally they will drive their colleagues to sign up, because colleagues trust their managers more than they trust someone sat in a corporate office sending an email. You can hold an event, or you can do handouts. So we gave out a load of mugs basically that said Workplace on it, please sign up here. And we gave little cards out for people as well. So you could collect like emojis to react to posts, and then you get free things and giveaway. So there's plenty of things you can do to engage. Doesn't just have to always be an email.
I absolutely agree. So I read a stat, and I have no idea how accurate it is, so don't quote me, but it was something like on an average business day, people receive 121 business emails. Now, whether that figure is true or false, I think we can all recognize that, how many emails come into the box and how many just get discarded. I think there's still a role for email, for the right message, and potentially for a recap at the end of the week of whatever's been on the intranet. But I fully agree with Benjamin that if you get your leaders talking to their teams, if they do town halls or online chats to their teams, if they're endorsing what's on the internet, and what you have to do is make sure there's relevant content on the internet, that means people are going to want to go there and your leaders are going to want to speak about that. But if you get the leaders brought in and speaking about it, people will soon follow.
I think we've had enormous trouble getting people to engage with the internet. Because of the plethora of email, things do get lost. And so my argument to the business leaders was, there needs to be a single source of information. There needs to be somewhere that people can go when they're looking for key information about the business strategy, for example, or key initiatives. Where can they go to find this? It's got to be the intranet. So I think I wish we had an intranet that was more responsive to recognize people's roles, the locations, interests, and that actually pushed relevant information to them. We're a million miles away from that. But what you can do in every, and we have far too much reliance on email. We don't have a cascade that I think works very well at a company level. So every email or email that goes out will have links in it that drives people onto the internet. And once they're there, then it's up to us to make sure that the information that they are interested in is visible and available to them, so that it's going to take time, but it will build up a culture of people thinking the intranet is the place to go.
I think the Cascade system with emails, emails driven by the Cascade system, because you're much more likely to read an email from your manager than you are from some comms person or from somebody you've never heard of. Works well in more pyramid-shaped organizations. I think one of the problem with partnerships is that they are essentially silos. So the manager has to be in charge of, making sure that the people do get information that's relevant to them without necessarily selecting it themselves. And somehow that has to be part of their KPI. How you manage that in a partnership setting, I'm really not qualified to say. So I can see the problems, but I think that's how it could be sorted out in some way. You'd need a pretty serious chief executive to do that, unless he's essentially prima pares and is just first among equals. How's that going to work? Good question. I don't know the answer, but I'm thinking about it now.
I would just say, just to add, I think this game's all about relationships. Yeah, if you can make the right relationships and get people to buy into what you're doing, and as well as leaders, I find that in our model, our HR business partners and PAs are great allies. So get them on board and almost recruit them as influencers as well. Because if you've got people, the amount of times people have asked a question and said, right, where can I find the answer to this? And they go to their HR business partner. Well, if the HR business partner knows that they can send them to the internet because that's where the relevant information is, right now you've educated one more person about, you start to change behavior a little bit. Eventually they'll start going to the internet on their own accord.
Perfect. Good answers. Good answers. And I hope that answered your question to the audience. So I want to come back to the main question that we were looking to answer and just make sure that we're covering that sufficiently. So to all of our experts, I know you've all kind of got different experience across different companies and within different sectors. So the main question is are comms just comms, or does the industry matter? If you want to share something that has worked maybe in one industry and not in another, that would be super helpful. But what is your take on if the industry matters as an internal comms specialist?
Shall I go first for a change? I thought it was all going to be about technology, and I was working in a very well-known company which had a major disaster, so that narrows it down to one, about 10 years ago. And one of the things we discovered was that technology was not the answer. If you really wanted guys to take in the same message and work out better ways of behavior, you stuck posters up in the canteens. That's probably the oldest form of internal communications, but it worked incredibly well. And when we tested it a few months later, it was far and away the most effective way of getting things to getting messages across and getting people to start thinking about changing their behaviors and to actually change their behaviors and, well, essentially not die. It's something that really, I think, needs to be remembered. It's still part of your toolkit. Don't let it go.
I'd agree with that. I think that posters have worked well in every single business that I've been in. It's an adjunct to the water cooler conversation, because where do you put them up? You put them up where people are gathered to make coffee, so they're going to be there for a few minutes, and they're, if they're not chatting to a colleague, then they're looking idly at what's posted on the fridges or on the wall. I think the face-to-face is never going to die. So things like that we used to do in different iterations in every business is coffee and connect. So you have senior leaders visiting offices. They should feel obligated to meet up with a group of people wherever they go and have a chat and really enable people to ask them questions and get to know them as people rather than just titles. So I think the face-to-face is also something that is never going to die out, and it's a virtual thing now. But what has really been impressive in Clifford Chance is how team leaders have really taken it upon themselves to help their teams feel connected, supported, informed, and that, you know, the dispersed communication that is going on has never been better, I don't think.
Yeah, I think if we talk about posters, posters have been the bane of my life since joining BT, because they are just, and I think, you know, if I speak to some of my colleagues about it, we always have an issue with posters. And I think it just depends on your audience. So in stores, yeah, posters have worked previously for us in retail. However, around our head office in London for BT, we don't get much value out of them. And to be fair, it depends what your message is and what you're communicating on that poster. So sometimes it's not relevant. So I remember having a really long conversation with somebody from HR, and she wanted to do posters about new rewards scheme that was coming. And just the way it was kind of laid out and set was really dry. There was a call to action, you know, sign up for your latest rewards until you've got until this time. But I guess, you know, putting those in lifts around the canteen, they sometimes just become dry wall art, because they don't look any different when you change them. They have the same branding. They have kind of a similar image and a similar message. So I think what we try to do is sometimes steer away from just that static print that you get, because it can look the same. And I think that's sometimes the risk we run in that as well.
For me, I think, you know, good comms is good comms. Yeah. I think the principles will apply to any business and any industry, which is, you know, get your leaders standing up, sponsoring your communications and your project. Get behind the same purpose, everybody behind the same goal, and all your comms really funnels into, you know, driving that business goal forward. Then it's about understanding your channels, you know, what your channels are good for, bad for, what channels are available within the business, and who are they available to. And then making sure that you know your audience, because as you guys have just said there, your audience might react differently to the same piece of comms depending on who they are, where they are, how they work. So the nuances always change across businesses. Tone of voice might change, style, branding might change. But that idea of getting everyone aligned, getting your leaders involved at a sort of sponsorship level, getting them to bang the drum, making sure that they're bought in, because if they buy in, everyone else buys in. Then using your channels effectively, and you can only use your channels effectively if you really understand your audience and what makes them tick, because ultimately you've got to sell the comms to them. You've got to let them see the why in what you're telling them, why it's relevant to them, why it's important to the business. And if you can communicate that, I think you can take it across any business and into any industry.
So it sounds like, I'm going to echo what you said, James, that comms are comms. So industry, regardless of industry, it's about knowing your audience, you know, knowing your channels, and really knowing what's going to work in your message. So we're going to move in now to reactive comms. So given the latest news, the pandemic, everything that's going on in the world, I'd like to speak a bit now about how a crisis might affect your role as an internal comm specialist. We actually ended up, I'm sure a lot of the attendees know this, but we pushed this event back a couple weeks because at the end of May, it just still seemed like all of the internal comms managers and specialists that we were speaking with were just absolutely swamped. So I know that specifically to COVID-19 has been a huge challenge over the past couple of months. So I'd like to understand like what a crisis might look like in the industry that you're in beyond COVID-19, or if you want to use COVID as an example. And do you have a reactive internal comm strategy for when a crisis does hit, how it's affected your role, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I suppose, you know, everyone probably has heard a lot about COVID-19. It's a crisis. We've all had to adapt, and everyone will be familiar with how their business has adapted. But fair play to GVC. Our management have been incredible. They made the right decisions early. They communicated, and they got everybody behind the key message. The key message when the crisis hit was, we're going to do everything we can to preserve cash and protect jobs, and that permeated through every bit of comms we did. But a real crisis in our business can actually be quite unpleasant, because we have a retail estate, and if, you know, criminals target some of our shops, there can be some quite unpleasant consequences, and that's a proper crisis. And that's where you really need to show the human side. You need, as comms people, you need to show the human side, and you need to get your leaders acting quickly and showing their human side. Because if you just go straight to process and straight to policy and everything like that, it doesn't land very well at all. you need to connect with people, and you need to be there for people and treat people as human beings first and foremost.
We have a fully formed crisis communication strategy and infrastructure in place. So we've got backup systems, and it's all well formed and formulated. And our EOG, which is our executive operations group, so as opposed to the leadership group, had a day out where they actually did a dummy run, and I think that was really useful, because what happens, as James said, it's about being human about it and not allowing, and if you're familiar with the process and you've experienced it once, you understand how it's going to impact not just you, but actually your teams and the business as a whole. And having a dummy run really helps people to engage with it as a human and not get overwhelmed by it. So I think I would highly recommend that whoever is responsible for your crisis response, that you set it, you take the time out to do a dummy run and let people experience it for themselves.
I can give you a non-COVID example. About 30 years ago, I was working in a Japanese stockbroker and came into work on Monday morning to look at the big stack of newspapers. And it turned out that the company I worked for, which was then Securities, had been involved with Japanese gangsters, which was an open secret. Everybody knew it. Now it become headline news. And for about a month, the news sort of dribbled out and dribbled out and dribbled out, and the CEO resigned, and all sorts of people fell on their swords, not literally, but figuratively. And there was a major shake-up, and the organization was changed. And during that whole process, I kept the internal comms going. I was responsible for external as well, so it was quite an exciting time. Kept the internal comms going and making sure that people saw those clippings and those bits of news and what was being said, and kept the information flowing. And that was something that I was congratulated on, thanked for. And what was interesting was, with the combination of that and word of mouth, I guess, that about 9 months later, the graduate recruitment numbers had gone from applications of about, I think, 100 a year to nearly 1,000. So an ill wind that blows nobody any good, but keep communicating seems to be the secret behind that.
Yeah, I think in terms of coronavirus, it's been a massive behavioral change for us as a business. So I was actually on holiday in February and came back in March after 3 weeks, and it just felt like I came back to a different world. I was on holiday in Australia, came back on the flight, landed, and I was like, what is happening? Literally, like, just boom. And I came into work on the Monday, and we were sent home on the Tuesday, and then it was work from home since then. So I think in terms of my team, we've been really agile, and we've been really quick to adapt to getting comms out really, really quickly, because we have 20,000 people just in our division in consumer to inform. So that includes retail stores that were closing. We went into lockdown a week later, and people were still working in our contact centers. We had to get them set up and working from home, 10,000 people. And I guess we had to lead that with really clear messages from our leaders. And that was some of the hard part. So getting really clear and concise directions for what people should do and what they shouldn't do. We had a couple of unhappy people in some of our contact centers contacting local press with pictures from years ago saying that there was no social distancing. So we had to tackle some of that from an external and an internal point, but we had to align. And it was a really, really big operation. And when I look back now, it didn't feel like it was that crazy. But if you actually think about it, some of us were up till midnight answering questions from colleagues, just replying to them on Workplace. And it's just that constant engagement that people needed, because it was such a time of uncertainty. People didn't know if they were going to lose their jobs. Luckily, no one in our business has. And it is obviously still an ongoing pandemic. It's a lot more stable now than it was. But for the first couple of months, it was really, really tough, especially being in internal comms. You are sometimes the punching bag, and people think you know all of the answers. They think you know when they're going back to work. They think you are the voice of the business, and sometimes you don't know those answers, and it's really hard to kind of smooth out people when they're really, really sometimes scared. Some people live with vulnerable adults. They don't want to go to work because it might put their family at risk. And it's been a really, really hard time to manage.
Sounds like that human element is really the key of just, leveraging, like reaching out to people and saying, I'm human too, and kind of building the relationship that way has been really important during a crisis. And Madeleine, I think we've kind of used the metaphor of a fire drill, which I think works really well with what you were saying is, a fire drill, everyone knows how to react because you practice it, and you practice it from when you're a little kid. So maybe that's something that we need to start thinking about when it comes to reacting to these big changes, just so that we're a bit ready and a bit less caught on our toes. I think we have time for one more question before we open it up to questions from the audience. So just wanted to cover communicating sensitive topics. So what advice do you have when communicating sensitive topics, and what policies and procedures do you lean on to do so? So some examples of sensitive topics might be diversity and inclusion policies, or your dress code, that kind of thing.
I think the key thing for me is actually think about your audience. It's with any communication, it is about put yourself in your audience shoes, think about how it's going to land for them, and you can always test it. I think that if there's one thing that I've learned from Black Lives Matters is that is not to make assumptions, and kind of not to recognize that you might be in a bubble, however well-intentioned you are. You may be still operating in a bubble, and you may be saying stuff that is not going to land well. So I think that if you've got a sensitive topic, test it before you send it out. If you're at all unsure about about the area that you're communicating in.
I think having an authentic voice is important, because people will soon see through it if it's inauthentic. And if you genuinely make a mistake on these topics, as long as you're authentic and you hold your hands up, you say, look, I got it wrong, I'm sorry. As long as people know that that's you, and that you're open, and you're showing the real you, and you're showing that ability to adapt and to listen and to understand, people will forgive you if you maybe get it wrong. But they won't forgive you if they think you've lied to them.
Yeah, I think it's the human aspects that through all these answers is, as you say, people will accept you if you accept that you've made a mistake and you apologize for it and move on and do something different and show that you've changed your behavior as a result of the mistake you've made. And it's pretty much, I guess, common sense, but that can often get forgotten in these things when they get sort of put into the big corporate blender that sort of grinds up all sorts of ideas. Keep it human, essentially.
Yeah, I agree with you there, James. I think there's definitely a place for honesty, and you are trusted as the voice of the business a lot of the time. So no matter where you've got your information from, whether it's come from HR, whether it's come from marketing, from the business unit, you're the one comms in that out, and people trust you from what you're saying, that it is truth to the core. And I think sometimes, especially with Black Lives Matter, what's been highlighted is that sometimes we need to do something rather than nothing. You need to judge the situation, but sometimes being silent it's suicide, and it's really, really damaging in the long run. And I think sometimes that's what we've suffered from, in that we're a little bit too scared to say something, so we say nothing, but we haven't taken the time to really talk to subject matter experts, really judge that situation in particular, and say, right, we need to go out with something on this, and it needs to be a really strong, clear message. And sometimes being silent and trying to hide behind that is really not good for the long run.
Yeah, people fill the void of silence, and sometimes it means we have to challenge our leaders and push them a little bit more and question them. But that's what comms professionals are all about.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions now. We have had one more come in, but if anyone else has any questions, you can throw them in the question box. So this question is about data-driven decision-making at a board level. And if you've had any experience with that, with decisions coming from the top down that were made via data, whereas you kind of have that human connection, how do you manage that? How do you manage up and just kind of communicate that you might have a different perspective on the decision that's being made?
I think it's about, you know, if you, whatever method the execs use to arrive at their decisions, well, that's their prerogative. So your challenge as comms professionals is to ensure that you're explaining the why to people. Well, why have we taken this decision? Well, we've taken this decision because the data suggests it's the best thing to do. I don't really think how the exec arrive at their decisions changes what we fundamentally do. We have to understand it, and we have to understand how to interpret that in a way that is going to resonate with the audience.
And I think that's an interesting point, because going back to an earlier question about does the industry matter, I think as a comms person, I've always argued if I'm going into a new industry, like when I went into Lang O'Rourke, knew nothing about the business at all. And I thought that was helpful, because I would question everything, and I would deliver messaging down to the lowest common denominator so that it could land with everybody. I wasn't just talking to the initiated. So actually ignorance can be very useful, and you do have to make sure that what you're communicating makes sense to everybody. So I would agree with James that it doesn't matter really how the decisions are made. It's just about whether that you can communicate it in a way that will land with the audience.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bit about the angle of your messaging, so where it comes from and how you deliver it. So it, you know, plenty of examples. It could be that there's a change in the pension scheme, or it could be that there's a change in, you know, fair reward and how people are paid, or bonuses, or it could be anything. However you want to position that to your audience is what, you know, that's what we do as comms people. It's how we build in strategy and narrative, and how we tell people why we're making this decision and why it's the right thing to do for the business. And sometimes if you miss that mark, that can then sometimes spark that people don't understand why. It can create anger. And I think one of the things that happened recently for us is we decided to give bonuses out at BT, but not pay rises. So we built comms and put that out around that, and people understood the fact that no one was expecting bonuses or pay rises because of the situation right now. And the reason why we're taking that is because we're protecting our future. We've cut dividend for the first time, which means that we're not paying any dividends out for the next, I think, 2 years, but we're reinvesting in our business, and that's why we're doing it. And to tell people that story is how they buy into it as well.
And one other point that I would make is that when I was implementing a top-down cascade messaging, I think the see one, do one methodology is really helpful, because I think if you have a complicated message and you know that you're going to have to deliver it, it makes you pay attention to how it's delivered to you. You ask the questions then of the person who owns the messaging. You get every opportunity to think, okay, I'm going to have to deliver this. I'm going to have to be comfortable with this message. I'm going to need to know the answers myself and to own this messaging. So I think in terms of if there are complicated messages, a cascade can work really well, because it makes everyone in the chain own the messaging.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's it's sometimes a little bit of an awakening call if the message affects you. So even if you're having to comms it and you are part of the audience that would actually receive that message, you kind of think twice sometimes. And then you go back over some of the times where you might have put stuff out and you haven't thought twice, for instance. And it's sometimes a nice reminder as well.
You're in this interesting situation where you're in between, as it were, management and workforce. So you're the voice of both to each. And so you can make the best of that, and I think you have to, because that's an important way of maintaining credibility. If you're seen as siding with one or the other, then you're going to lose credibility to whoever the other party happens to be. So keep it real, is it?
Keep it very real.
Keep it real. That's where we're going to have to end, unfortunately, but I think that's a great place to end. We still have lots of questions that we could cover on our list, but that is all the time that we have. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists. That was a really, really great and insightful discussion. I'm just going to share my screen quickly here if I can. Nope. It's not going to let me, but we do offer free content strategy workshops. So if you are an attendee or a panelist and you have an internal comms campaign that you are just wanting to talk out or work through, we do offer free workshops together for anyone who did attend our event. So if you are interested in talking to us about any guidance on an internal comms campaign, feel free to reach out. You have my email already. And we also have another event next week, actually, which is on June 24th about creativity within corporate compliance. So we'll make sure to send out a little bit more information about that if you did enjoy this event and if that's a relevant topic for you. But that's everything for today. Sorry, we went a little bit over time, but I just didn't want to stop the discussion, really. So thank you, everyone, for spending your morning with us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.